At sunrise, a convoy of grain trucks moves slowly across the Sahel plain. The air is still, except for the hum of engines and the soft rhythm of tires over red dust. A driver waves the Burkina Faso flag as he enters a checkpoint built not by foreign contractors, but by his own village cooperative. It's called the Food Bridge, a $2.6 billion plan linking farms and silos from Mali to Niger, across 11 nations that once depended on foreign aid to eat. And for the first time in decades, Africa is not asking for permission to feed itself. It's building a system to do it. This is not a story about charity. It's a story about control, about who writes the rules of survival. For half a century, the International Monetary Fund offered its menu of reforms. Cut your subsidies, open your ports, sell your grain reserves. The result was predictable. Imported food got cheaper, but homegrown independence disappeared. Families traded harvest for hunger. And in every drought or crisis, a new loan arrived, labeled relief. Now, a different voice rises from Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré calls the food bridge the bread of sovereignty. Instead of borrowing from the IMF, the Alliance of Sahel States has pooled gold revenues, local taxes, and African Development Bank credits to fund a network of silos, solar farms, and regional grain trains. Their goal is simple yet revolutionary. By 2027, to replace the IMF's menu of debt with Africa's own recipe for food security. For the men driving those trucks, this bridge is more than commerce. It's proof that dignity can be delivered in sacks of millet. It's a promise that hunger will no longer be a weapon traded for policy. The question, of course, is whether the world will let it stand. Western analysts already call it a parallel economy. Others see it as the start of a new African century. If this story matters for Africa's future, stay with me, because the next few minutes may explain how a $2.6 billion bridge of grain could challenge a $1 trillion institution, and why the fight for food may soon decide the fight for freedom itself. The story began quietly, without the drama of sanctions or protests. In January 2025, inside the modest conference hall of Ouagadougou's presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré signed a document that would later be called the most defiant economic act in modern African history. It was the founding charter of the $2.6 billion Food Bridge Initiative, a cooperative framework between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the core of the AES alliance. Instead of asking for IMF credit lines, these nations agreed to pool their own resources: gold revenues, agricultural taxes, and sovereign bonds guaranteed by regional banks. The plan was bold, but deeply practical. It aimed to connect 11 countries through a self-sustaining food corridor, a chain of 38 strategic silos, 400 farm tech centers, and 2,000 kilometers of upgraded rail and road links. Each node would store, process, and distribute grains, fertilizers, and seeds across the Sahel. By controlling the entire cycle, from seed to shipment, the AES leaders hope to stabilize prices, create jobs, and insulate Africa from the speculative shocks of global markets. For decades, IMF reform packages had promised the same stability through market discipline. They required governments to cut farm subsidies, privatize mills, and peg currencies to foreign benchmarks. The result was dependence. Burkina Faso imported 60% of its rice, and its farmers watched prices collapse whenever global trade shifted. The food bridge reversed that logic. It rewarded production, not austerity. At the launch ceremony, Traoré stood before rows of farmers in faded uniforms and said, "The soil remembers who abandoned it. We will no longer sell our hunger for their relief." His voice echoed across the hall as local cooperatives signed partnership papers. Within weeks, construction began outside Bobo Dioulasso, grain silos rising beside solar arrays, local engineers training crews with borrowed machines from Ghana and Senegal. One man, a sorghum farmer named Adama Kabore, became an early symbol of what the new system promised. For years, he sold his harvest for barely $90 a ton to intermediaries linked with foreign buyers. Under the food bridge contracts, the government's cooperative now buys directly for $230 a ton, and half of his village works in the new storage facility. "We used to beg for buyers," he told a journalist. "Now trucks come to us." The initiative's design was audacious. All transactions settled in the new Sahel trade unit, a digital clearing token pegged to gold and grain values instead of the CFA franc. That move alone startled financial observers in Paris and Washington. Economists warned of monetary fragmentation and uncoordinated fiscal policy. But within the AES capitals, those phrases meant freedom. By the end of 2025, preliminary data showed local inflation easing, harvest volumes up 18%, and regional employment climbing, especially among youth in logistics, transport, and solar maintenance. Western media framed the project as shadow financing, alleging Chinese and Russian support behind the scenes. The AES governments dismissed it as propaganda. In their eyes, the food bridge was not a rival to the West, but an act of repair, an effort to rebuild a continent's broken food chain after half a century of dependency. When a reporter asked Traoré if he feared IMF retaliation, he smiled and said, "You cannot punish a man who stopped eating your bread." By mid-2026, more nations signaled interest. Chad, Guinea, and even Ghana observed the blueprint. The African Development Bank quietly endorsed the model, calling it a proof of indigenous capital mobilization. For the first time in generations, the word sovereignty appeared in financial reports not as rhetoric, but as policy. Yet, beneath the optimism, tension brewed. IMF envoys warned of credit risk contagion, hinting that donor programs could shrink if the initiative expanded. Anonymous analysts suggested Burkina Faso might face sanctions similar to those that crippled Sudan's reform drive decades earlier. Still, the trucks kept rolling, silos kept filling, and farmers kept signing new contracts. The idea was spreading faster than diplomacy could contain it. A bridge had been built, not of steel and stone, but of trust between nations once told they were too poor to feed themselves. But as this new network strengthened, one question grew louder in Washington and Brussels. What happens when Africa no longer needs the IMF's menu? By February 2026, the food bridge was no longer just an experiment. It had become a movement. Across the Sahel, silos stood like monuments to a new kind of independence. Farmers spoke of selling to ourselves. Truck drivers carried banners reading, "No loans, only grain." And in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré prepared for what would become the defining speech of his leadership. The hall was packed that morning. Delegations from 12 African nations, ministers from the AES bloc, and foreign observers filling every seat. Cameras from Al Jazeera and RT Africa waited for his words. On the table lay two folders, one from the IMF, offering a new emergency credit facility, and another bearing the seal of the alliance, a proposed expansion of the food bridge into West Africa's coastal states. Traoré lifted the second folder. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "no more loans for life's basics. We are no longer students at the IMF's table. We are the builders of our own." The applause drowned out the microphones. Outside, hundreds gathered under the noon sun, waving signs that read, "Feed Africa first," and "Bread before debt." Local radio repeated his line for hours. Within days, it was trending across African social media. Then came the reaction. The IMF's regional office in Dakar released a warning about unsustainable fiscal pathways and market isolation risks. Western analysts claimed the food bridge was destabilizing traditional credit markets. One think tank in Washington went further, labeling the project a populist threat to financial order. Yet, inside Burkina Faso, those criticisms sounded hollow. Inflation was down, wages were rising, and the silos were full. Traoré responded not with anger, but with symbolism. He redirected $600 million from gold revenues, money that would once have been used for debt repayment, into the food bridge's expansion fund. He ordered that every new storage site include a library corner and a school garden. "Sovereignty," he said, must feed both body and mind. His cabinet called it the Grain and Knowledge Act. International media were split. The Economist described Traoré as the anti-IMF populist. Le Monde called him Africa's stubborn idealist. But in markets and villages, he was something simpler, a man who had kept his word. In the Sahel city of Gao, a young logistics officer named Mariam Kone recalled the first rail convoy that crossed into Niger carrying millet, rice, and oilseed. "It felt like the border disappeared," she said. "We were not Malians or Burkinabè for that moment. We were Africans feeding Africans." But success bred scrutiny. Reports emerged of diplomatic pressure behind closed doors. Western donors threatened to reconsider certain aid packages. Trade envoys warned of compatibility issues with WTO rules. A leaked memo from a European policy group referred to the food bridge as Africa's economic firewall. Still, the AES alliance refused to slow down. They invited observers from the African Union, the Arab League, and even the BRICS bloc to tour the facilities. Delegates from Egypt and Kenya proposed linking their own agricultural programs to the network. The idea was morphing into something larger than the Sahel, an integrated African food grid. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the emotional weight of this shift was tangible. In villages once dependent on food imports, children now carried grain sacks marked "Produced in the Sahel." It wasn't propaganda, it was pride. "For the first time," said a teacher in Dori, "our lessons about independence have a smell, the smell of fresh millet." As Traoré closed the summit, his final words carried both defiance and warning. "They may control banks, but they do not control hunger. Hunger is the voice of every nation that still breathes." The crowd erupted again, and this time even foreign reporters stood in silence. By nightfall, the video of his speech had reached millions. Across Africa, hashtags emerged. #FeedYourself and #AfricaBridge, not as slogans but as declarations. Farmers in Ghana held rallies supporting the movement. Students in Senegal debated whether the IMF could ever reform itself. The momentum was undeniable. The food bridge had crossed a line, from a national project to a continental statement. And as Western capitals scrambled to interpret its implications, one question lingered on every broadcast and analysis page. If food becomes power, who will try to cut this bridge first? By mid-2026, the effects of the food bridge were visible not only in trade reports but in daily life. The Sahel, once synonymous with famine warnings and dependency charts, began showing signs of quiet stability. In Burkina Faso's northern provinces, food markets stayed open later into the night. Families who once lined up for imported rice now bargained over locally milled sorghum. And for the first time in decades, national news opened not with donor pledges, but with harvest updates. Economically, the results were striking. Inflation dropped from 16% to just under 9% in a single year. Local production of grains rose 22%, and new jobs appeared where none existed before. Drivers, silo technicians, solar engineers, data clerks tracking grain flows. Government payrolls expanded modestly, but private cooperatives multiplied tenfold. Each week, the Ministry of Agriculture reported new trade links between AES nations, tracking the exchange of corn, cassava, and fertilizer through digital ledgers under the Sahel Trade Unit. But the deeper impact was psychological. The narrative of dependence, that Africa must borrow to survive, was breaking. In Dori, a mother named Aminata used to wait for the World Food Programme's trucks each season. Now, she sells millet to them instead. Her tone was steady when she spoke to a journalist. They once called it aid. Today, they call it purchase. The name changed when the power changed. Schools introduced new textbooks celebrating domestic agriculture. University students began studying sovereign economics, a new discipline exploring independence through trade rather than loans. On social media, Burkinabè youth used the phrase, "roads not loans," to describe a generation that would rather build infrastructure than sign debt agreements. Politically, the change was just as dramatic. Parliament passed the Local Sovereignty Act, requiring that 60% of all food imports be replaced by regional production within 3 years. The law also protected seed banks, banned the export of certain staple crops during shortages, and established penalties for price manipulation by foreign intermediaries. Critics in urban business circles called it protectionist. Rural communities called it justice. Opposition leaders accused the government of nationalism disguised as reform, warning that isolation could backfire. But opinion polls told another story. Support for Traoré's administration climbed above 80%, the highest since Burkina Faso's independence. The food bridge had become a moral banner. In neighboring Mali, the ripple effects grew stronger. Inspired by Burkina's results, Bamako launched its own 2.3 million-acre irrigation plan, linking the Niger River's basin to the food bridge supply chain. Mali's defense minister called it a victory for bread over bullets. Farmers there reported record yields in rice and groundnut, and local councils began organizing direct exchanges with Burkina Faso without IMF intermediaries. At the regional level, the AES alliance strengthened politically. The 3 states drafted the Sahel Food Security Pact, pledging to defend one another's agricultural zones as national assets. This marked the first time African defense cooperation explicitly linked security with food. As one Burkinabè general put it, "A hungry border is a weak border." Yet, not all consequences were celebratory. Western partners expressed concern about market distortions. Certain aid agencies scaled back operations, citing duplication of efforts. International banks quietly downgraded Burkina Faso's credit outlook, warning of policy divergence. Traoré responded in a televised address. "We will no longer measure our worth by their ratings, but by our people's fullness." Inside the country, debates simmered about sustainability. Could the food bridge survive droughts, or was it too reliant on political unity? Economists warned that the AES needed stronger logistics management and crop insurance systems. Some ministers pushed to invite neutral observers from the African Union to certify transparency, fearing accusations of mismanagement. Still, ordinary citizens saw something unprecedented, a government project that reached them directly. A young volunteer at a silo in Koudougou said, "We are not waiting for miracles. We are the miracle." By the end of 2026, the Sahel was feeding itself faster than forecasts predicted. Exports to coastal states began for the first time, reversing decades of dependency. Burkinabè grain reached ports in Ghana and Togo under banners that read, "Made by Africa, for Africa." Yet as stability took root, so did unease among traditional donors and investors. Analysts began whispering about the Sahel model becoming contagious. Inside IMF corridors, confidential memos circulated warning that the AES food bridge represents a paradigm shift incompatible with standard credit instruments. The bridge had become more than infrastructure. It was an idea, and as ideas spread, so did resistance. The question looming over 2027 was no longer whether the food bridge could work, but whether the world would allow it to succeed. As 2027 approached, the food bridge became impossible for the world to ignore. In Washington, analysts at the Atlantic Policy Council circulated a classified memo titled "The Sahel Economic Firewall." It warned that Africa's new self-financing network could erode Western influence over fiscal discipline. The language was clinical, but the concern was unmistakable. If Africa could fund food, it could one day fund freedom. At the International Monetary Fund's spring meeting, a senior U.S. delegate posed the question aloud. If member states can opt out of IMF mechanisms, what remains of global coordination? Behind the diplomatic phrasing lay an old fear, the loss of leverage. For decades, food insecurity had quietly enforced economic compliance. Now, the Sahel was flipping that logic. In Paris, French newspapers ran alarmed headlines. Le Figaro called the food bridge a decolonization of agriculture. Others accused Burkina Faso of aligning with non-transparent lenders, a veiled reference to Russia and China. Yet both Moscow and Beijing stayed cautious. China's agriculture ministry praised the initiative as inspirational, while denying any role in funding. Russia, meanwhile, offered to share fertilizer technology without conditions, fueling Western suspicion further. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, the tone was different. Delegates applauded the Sahel bloc's defiance. Kenya's representative declared, "If Africa can feed itself, it can finally negotiate as an equal." The hall erupted in cheers. Even countries still bound by IMF programs, like Tanzania and Sierra Leone, expressed interest in regional autonomy frameworks. The United States tried to recalibrate its message. In a speech at Johns Hopkins University, a State Department official emphasized mutual respect for African-led solutions. But behind the scenes, U.S. grain exporters worried about shrinking markets. Analysts noted a quiet lobbying surge in Washington to engage or contain the food bridge model. Media across Europe warned of a geoeconomic shock. In Berlin, economists debated whether Africa's grain independence might raise global prices. Meanwhile, African news outlets celebrated with pride, calling the food bridge the first institution not designed in New York. By late 2026, Western financial ratings for Burkina Faso slipped slightly, but regional confidence soared. Investors from Ghana and South Africa joined the initiative, treating it as proof of internal resilience. Across the Atlantic, a veteran columnist for the Washington Post summed it up best. The IMF once fed Africa with loans. Now Africa feeds itself, and the world must learn to digest that. But as momentum grew, so did a quieter question in policy circles. Would the guardians of the old order let this new bridge stand, or begin searching for ways to dismantle it? The final scenes of this story are not found in headlines or policy papers. They live in the quiet rhythm of the Sahel. As dusk falls over the plains, a convoy of grain trucks hums down a new asphalt road between Kaya and Niamey. The air smells of millet and diesel. Children wave as the trucks pass, their laughter echoing over the dry fields. For them, this bridge is not theory. It is dinner, work, and hope rolled into motion. Ibrahim Traoré once said, "The road to dignity is built with what we grow, not what we borrow." Those words now carry the weight of an entire generation. Across Africa, farmers who once waited for relief shipments now ship their own produce abroad. Engineers who once built for foreign firms now design silos under African contracts. The food bridge has become more than an infrastructure project. It is a philosophy that control over food is control over destiny. But this path is fragile. Drought still threatens. Pressure from abroad will not disappear. And yet, there is a calm determination spreading through the Sahel, a belief that sovereignty is worth the struggle. The trucks keep rolling, the silos keep filling, and the people keep repeating the phrase that began it all: feed yourself. In Washington and Brussels, policymakers debate the numbers, but on the ground, the meaning is simple. Every sack of grain produced under the AES alliance carries a message written without words. Africa will not kneel. If you've followed this story from the start, you've witnessed a continent rewriting its place in the global order, one harvest at a time. The IMF once served Africa a menu of dependence. The food bridge offers something far more nourishing: the taste of freedom. If this story gave you perspective, leave one word below: dignity. If you still believe Africa's future must be decided by its own hands, press like and share this story so more people understand what's at stake. And if you believe justice, self-reliance, and faith still matter, keep watching, because this is only the beginning of Africa's long road to sovereignty. May God bless Africa, the land of bread, courage, and unbroken spirit.